She arrived with 12 cents in her pocket and a pass she refused to speak about. They said she wouldn't last the week. By spring, she had brought down the most powerful man in the territory and built something no one in Black Hollow had ever seen before. But tonight, we're not starting at the ending. We're starting at the moment she stepped off that ridge road in the middle of a snowstorm, her dress torn at the hem, her jaw set like iron, and every single person who looked at her had already decided she was already dead. They were wrong. If this story grabs you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this reaches. Now stay with me, because this is only the beginning. The wind off the mountain came in hard that evening. It didn't blow so much as push, a flat, relentless pressure that came down through the pine ridge and hit the settlement of Black Hollow like a fist through wet cloth. By the time it reached the main road, it had already stripped the warmth out of everything it touched. The horses tied outside Devlin's supply store stamped their hooves and turned their heads away from it. The lanterns hung along the storefronts flickered and swung on their hooks. A tin bucket someone had left outside the assay office went rolling and clanging down the frozen mud road until it lodged under a wagon wheel and stopped. Most of the men on the street had seen worse winters. This was Black Hollow. Bad winters were the agreement you made when you decided to stay. But the cold that night felt different, purposeful almost, like it was clearing the road for something. She appeared at the north end of town just after the last light left the sky. Nobody saw exactly where she came from. One moment the road was empty. The next, there was a figure walking out of the gray dark between the pine trees, moving steadily toward the lantern light of the settlement. She walked like someone who had already decided to keep walking regardless of what waited at the end. Not fast, not slow, just committed. One foot, then the other, on the frozen, rutted road. Clarence Mudd, who ran the feed stall near the north entrance and had nothing better to do than watch the road when there was no business, squinted at her for a long moment before he spat into the snow beside his boot. "Woman," he said to nobody in particular. His boy, maybe 11 years old, stood beside him, pulling apart a piece of dried rope for something to do with his hands. "Where'd she come from?" Clarence squinted harder. "Ridge Road, looks like. Nobody comes down the Ridge Road this time of evening." "Nobody with any sense," Clarence said. She was closer now, and what the lantern light revealed was not encouraging. The dress she wore was dark wool. Had been good once, probably, but that was a while ago. The hem was torn in 2 places, and the tear on the left side had been mended with something that wasn't the same thread, so the repair stood out even from a distance. No coat. She had something wrapped around her shoulders. A man's work jacket, by the look of it, too big for her, the sleeves pushed back from her wrists. But it was open down the front, and she hadn't bothered to hold it closed against the wind. Her hair was pinned up with what appeared to be 2 different pins holding a job that needed 4, and strands of it had broken loose and were whipping around her face in the wind, and she did not reach up to fix them. She was carrying nothing, no bag, no case, nothing in her hands. Clarence's boy stared. "She got no luggage?" "Nope." "She walking from somewhere to somewhere?" Clarence considered that. Both, probably. She reached the edge of the feed stall, and for a moment she looked directly at Clarence, and he got a better look at her face. She was somewhere in her 30s. It was hard to say exactly because her face had the quality of a person who had lived harder than their years suggested but hadn't broken under it yet. Her eyes were dark, set deep, and they were doing something that Clarence didn't quite have a word for. They were exhausted, genuinely exhausted, the kind of tired that gets into the bones and sets up permanent residence. But they were also alert, watching everything, calculating. Not the eyes of someone lost, the eyes of someone arriving. "Evening," she said to him. Her voice was steady. That was the part Clarence would mention later, when he retold the story to anyone who would listen. 12 miles of Ridge Road in a torn dress with no luggage and no coat worth mentioning, and her voice came out as flat and even as if she was asking the time. "Evening," he said back, more out of reflex than anything. She didn't stop walking. Black Hollow in the winter of that year was the kind of place that didn't appear on many maps, and the ones that did show it usually spelled the name wrong, or placed it slightly east of where it actually sat on the mountain. It had started 15 years earlier as a prospecting camp, a collection of canvas tents and one permanent structure, which was the assay office, because the assay office was always the first permanent structure, and it had grown the way settlements like that always grew, messily, without a plan, in whatever direction the next problem pushed it. There were now roughly 300 people who lived in or around Black Hollow, depending on how you counted the men in the outer mine camps who came into town for supplies every 2 weeks and caused trouble when they did. The permanent residents were a mix: miners who had decided to stop moving and bring their families up, a handful of merchants who had arrived to service the mining trade and found that staying was more profitable than leaving, and the category that defied easy description, the ones who had come from somewhere else and hadn't explained why, and Black Hollow, being the kind of place it was, didn't ask. The settlement had 2 saloons, one church that was also used as a schoolroom on weekdays, a supplies store, a blacksmith, an assay office, a doctor who was also the barber, and who people went to see with significantly less confidence in each capacity, and a boarding house. The boarding house was at the south end of the main road, set slightly back from the street on a lot that was bigger than it needed to be, because whoever had originally built it had been optimistic about the size of the building they were going to put there. What actually stood on the lot was a 2-story structure that had started as 4 rooms and expanded outward in 3 different directions over the years, as various owners had added to it, so that the building looked from the outside like it had been constructed by several people who weren't communicating with each other, which was more or less what had happened. The sign above the door said Cross Boarding House, G, Cross, Prop P. The paint on the sign was faded enough that you had to already know what it said to read it. Gideon Cross was 37 years old and had owned the boarding house for 4 years, which put his ownership at precisely the moment when the original owner, a man named Briggs, had drunk himself into a debt he couldn't get out of and sold the property to cover it. Gideon had come up from the lower territories with money. He'd earned working the rail lines, and what he'd saved from 2 years of not spending anything, he didn't have to spend. And he'd bought the boarding house because he was tired of moving and because a boarding house seemed like the kind of business that would always be needed as long as people kept arriving and needing somewhere to sleep. What he hadn't fully considered was the operating side of the business. Gideon was competent at the practical things. He could repair a roof, unclog a drain, replace a broken window, fix a stove that wasn't drawing right. He was patient with difficult guests and didn't cheat anyone on the room rates. He kept the place clean enough that nobody complained about the cleanliness, though clean might have been a generous word for what he maintained. What he was not good at was the cooking. The meals at Cross Boarding House had become something of a local joke, not cruel exactly, more resigned. The miners who stayed there ate what was put in front of them because they were hungry, and it was food, and the price included it, but nobody was going out of their way to praise it. A man named Dobbins, who had stayed at the boarding house for 6 months the previous winter, had described the breakfast porridge as the kind of thing that prepares a man for suffering, and the description had gotten around. The other problem was that Gideon had no staff. He'd had a woman who came in to help with the cooking for a while, a widow named Mrs. Perch, but she'd moved down the mountain in October when her daughter had a baby and needed help, and Gideon had been managing the whole operation himself since then, which was why the meals had declined from mediocre to actively discouraging. He had 6 rooms currently occupied out of 10. The empty 4 were not empty because of lack of demand. They were empty because word had gotten around that the place was being run by one man who was very capable at everything, except the thing that made a boarding house worth staying in. He was behind on his ledger, not desperate, not yet, but behind. I was standing at the front desk going through the accounts, when the door opened and the cold came in, and then the woman came in behind the cold. She stood in the doorway for exactly 1 second before she stepped fully inside and pushed the door shut behind her. She did it like someone who understood that every second you left a door open in winter was a decision you were making about everyone in the room, and she had made the decision to close it. Gideon looked up from the ledger. She looked at him. Then she looked at the room, the desk, the 4 chairs arranged around the cold stove in the corner, the stairs going up to the 2nd floor, the lamp on the desk that was the only good light source in the space. She looked at it the way you look at a space when you're trying to understand the logic of it, not just what it was, but how it was being used and what it could be. Then she looked back at him. "I'm looking for work," she said. Gideon put his pen down. He wasn't sure what he'd expected her to say, but that wasn't it. "What kind of work?" he said. "Whatever kind you have." He looked at her. The torn hem, the too big jacket, the hair half down in the wind-blown strands she still hadn't fixed, the total absence of luggage. "Where'd you come in from?" he asked. "North? Ridge Road?" "Yes." He frowned slightly. That road's it's not a good road to be on this late, in this weather. I know, she said. I was on it. There was something in the way she said it that shut down the follow-up questions. Not defensive, just final. She wasn't going to explain the Ridge Road, and she wasn't going to apologize for it, and she was not interested in his concern about it. He studied her for a moment. She stood completely still under that attention. Most people shifted when you looked at them that directly. Adjusted something, found something to look at. That wasn't your face. She didn't do any of that. She stood there and let him look and waited. I'm Gideon Cross, he said. I own this place. I know. The sign outside says Cross. What's your name? A brief pause. Eleanor Vale. Where are you from, Eleanor Vale? The second pause was a little longer. Not here. Gideon looked at her for another moment, and then he exhaled slowly through his nose, which was something he did when he was making a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with. I need someone who can cook, he said, and help run the place. It's not a high-wage position, but it includes a room and meals. Eleanor Vale looked at him steadily. What time does breakfast start? 6 o'clock. I'll need to see the kitchen tonight. It wasn't a question. Gideon picked up his lamp and said, This way, Juan. The kitchen was bad. Eleanor didn't say that out loud. She walked around it twice, opened the doors on the dry storage, checked the stove with her hand an inch from the surface to test the heat it was holding, lifted the lid on the one pot that had something in it, and looked at the contents and put the lid back down. She opened the cold storage and stood there for a moment counting what was there. She checked the flour bin and found it was about a third full, and the flour had started to clump along one side from humidity, which meant the bin wasn't sealing properly. She pressed her finger into the clump and confirmed it. Gideon watched all of this from the doorway. How long have you been cooking for the house by yourself? She asked. 6 weeks. 6 weeks, she repeated. She wasn't being unkind about it. It was just a fact she was accounting for. Mrs. Perch handled it before. She was good at it. You have 6 men staying here currently? 6, yes. When do they come down from the mine? Varies, usually between 4 and 6 in the evening. Eleanor closed the cold storage door. She turned and looked at the stove again. Really looked at it, the way a craftsperson looks at a tool they're about to trust their work to. It was a cast iron range, old but solid. The problem wasn't the stove. The problems were everything else. The flour bin needs a new seal, she said. I can fix that tomorrow. Tonight I can make something from what's here, but I want to be clear that what's here is not a lot. I can get supplies from Devlin's tomorrow morning. I'll make the list. She turned and looked at him directly. I want to understand the arrangement. Room, meals, and what wage? He told her the number. She was quiet for a moment. That's low. It's what I can manage right now. She held his gaze. He didn't look away from it, and he didn't inflate the number, and he didn't apologize for it. She seemed to respect that, or at least she didn't seem to resent it. All right, she said. Where's the room? Juan. He showed her upstairs. A small room at the end of the corridor, second floor rear, with a window that looked out over the back lot where the woodpile was. It had a single bed with a wool blanket, a chest of 3 drawers, a hook on the wall for hanging things. The window had a gap along the bottom of the frame where the cold came through, and she noticed it immediately and didn't mention it, just noted it with the same cataloging precision she'd applied to everything else. It'll do, she said. Gideon left her there and went back downstairs. He sat at his desk for a long time after that, not going back to the ledger, just sitting with the lamp and thinking about the particular quality of stillness she had. The way her voice hadn't wavered once in the whole conversation. Not when she said her name, not when she declined to explain where she'd come from, not when she told him the wage was low. There had been no performance of strength in it. It was just the actual thing, the real version of it. I didn't know anything about Eleanor Vale. She'd given him almost nothing. But he'd been operating this place for 4 years, and he'd met a lot of people, and he had developed a rough and imperfect sense for which ones were going to cause problems and which ones weren't. It wasn't foolproof. He'd been wrong before. He didn't think he was wrong now. He went back to the ledger and worked for another hour, and sometime during that hour he heard faintly the sound of activity in the kitchen. The stove being stoked, a pot being moved, something being measured out, small sounds, practical sounds. He didn't go check. He figured if something was burning, he'd smell it. At 5:30 the next morning, Gideon came downstairs, and the smell hit him at the top of the staircase. Not burned. Not the smell of his own cooking, which had a certain resigned institutional quality to it, like food that had accepted its fate. This was something else entirely. Coffee, first, real coffee, hot and strong, the smell of it filling the whole ground floor in a way that made the space seem larger and warmer than it actually was. And under that, bread. Fresh bread. Not the flat, dense loaves he'd been producing from the same recipe for 6 weeks. This was something that had risen properly, that had been handled right, that smelled the way bread was supposed to smell when someone who knew what they were doing had made it. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Through the open door of the kitchen, he could see Eleanor at the stove, back to him, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone working through a sequence they'd already planned completely before starting. Her hair was pinned up properly now. She'd changed into the dress she must have had in... No, wait. She hadn't had any luggage. He looked again. She was wearing the same dress from last night, but she'd done something with the torn hem, pinned it maybe, or there was something about the way she was standing. He couldn't see clearly from here. She turned with a pan in her hand and saw him in the doorway, and she said, "Sit down, coffee's ready." He sat down. She brought the coffee to the table where the men would eat, a long table in the room off the kitchen that served as the dining area, and set a mug in front of him and went back to the kitchen without ceremony. He drank the coffee. For a while he just sat there and drank it and listened to the sounds of the kitchen, which had taken on a completely different character in the 12 hours since he'd left her there. Something organized was happening, something considered. At 6 o'clock exactly, boots on the stairs announced the first of the men coming down, and within the next 10 minutes all 6 of his current residents had assembled at the table with the expressions of people who had smelled something promising and weren't fully prepared to believe it yet. Eleanor came out of the kitchen with a cast-iron pan and served them without fanfare, eggs and the bread she'd made, and something she'd done with the remains of what had been in the cold storage that turned into a simple hash with onion and dried meat, that nobody could quite explain except that it tasted like something you'd eat by choice rather than necessity. The table was quiet for the first few minutes. Not an uncomfortable quiet. The opposite kind. A man named Howell, who'd been staying at the boarding house for 3 months, and had the hollow-cheeked, faintly defeated look of someone who had been surviving rather than eating, took a second piece of bread without asking, and then looked slightly surprised at himself. Another man, Aldous Beckett, who drove supply wagons between Black Hollow and the lower settlements and stopped at the boarding house twice a month, looked at his plate, and then looked across the table at nobody in particular and said, "What happened in here?" Nobody answered him. They kept eating. From the kitchen, Eleanor said, without coming out, "There's more coffee." By the end of the first week, something had shifted. It wasn't one thing. It was an accumulation of things, small and practical and easy to dismiss individually, but unmistakable when you added them up. The flour bin had a new seal. She'd found the material in the storage shed and fixed it herself in under an hour, on the morning of the second day. The cold storage had been reorganized so that things were easier to find and things that needed to be used first were at the front. The gap at the bottom of her window upstairs had been stuffed with a strip of folded cloth. The 2 chairs in the front room that had been wobbly for as long as Gideon could remember had been tightened with a screwdriver she'd borrowed from his tools without asking, which was fine. The meals had continued. Word gets around in a small settlement in the winter when there isn't much else to talk about. By the 4th day, 2 of the men from the outer mine camp who were not staying at the boarding house had knocked on the door and asked, with some embarrassment, if they could pay for dinner. Gideon had looked at Eleanor. Eleanor had said yes and named a price, and they'd paid it and come in and sat at the table with the residents and eaten without incident. By the end of the first week, there were 3 of them coming in for the evening meal regularly. Gideon revised the ledger to account for this new income and sat back and looked at the number and thought that it wasn't a solution, but it was a direction. He and Eleanor hadn't talked much. Not personal talk, not about anything outside the running of the house. They had the kind of working conversation that a well-matched operation produces naturally, practical, quick, without waste. She told him what she needed. He sourced it. She told him what was coming in the next day, what she was planning, what she needed to prepare. He adjusted his schedule accordingly. It worked with a minimum of friction that surprised him slightly, because in his experience, 2 people who didn't know each other very well needed time to work out the kinks, and there hadn't been much kink working required. He knew almost nothing about her still. She didn't volunteer information, and he hadn't pushed for it. He knew she was from somewhere else, which everyone in Black Hollow was, one way or another. He knew she'd come in on the ridge road alone in the dark in December, which told him she'd needed to get somewhere that night, more than she'd needed to be comfortable. He knew she worked as if the work was the only thing in the room worth her attention. On the evening of the seventh day, after the dinner service and after the men had gone back to their rooms or back out to wherever men went in the evenings, Eleanor sat down at the long table with the account book she'd started keeping for the kitchen, separate from his main ledger, her own record of what came in and what went out of the kitchen. And she was going through it with a pencil, marking things. Gideon was at the desk in the front room, visible from the dining room through the open door. He looked up at her. "You keeping your own ledger?" he said. "Kitchen ledger," she said. "It makes it easier to see waste." "Find any?" She turned a page. "Some. Less than there was. There was a significant amount of waste built up in how the dry stores were being organized, things going bad before they were used." "That's on me." "Partly." She made a note. "The butter consumption is high. The men are using more than the bread requires at breakfast. You going to tell them to use less butter?" She looked up at him. There was something in her expression, not quite humor, but in the neighborhood of it. "I'm going to make the bread better so it doesn't need as much butter." He looked at her for a moment. "That's a more diplomatic solution." "It's a more practical one." She went back to the ledger. He watched her for another few seconds and then went back to his own work. Outside, the wind picked up again, pressing against the windows with that flat insistence it had. Somewhere down the road, the sign above the saloon was creaking on its chains. It was on the 9th day that Victor Hale came. Gideon had known it was coming, in the abstract way you know something unpleasant is coming when you live in a place long enough to understand how the machinery of it works. Victor Hale was the regional agent for the Consolidated Mountain Mining Company, which held the primary extraction licenses for the four most productive mines in and around Black Hollow. The company's actual headquarters were 400 miles south in the city, and the company's actual owners were further away still. Men in offices who looked at production numbers and did not think much about the places those numbers came from. Victor Hale was what happened in the gap between those men and this place. I was in his mid-40s, heavy-set in the way of someone who had been physically strong once and hadn't yet fully transitioned to just heavy. He wore better clothes than anyone else in Black Hollow, which wasn't saying much, but he made sure you noticed anyway. He had a way of entering a room that was designed to establish immediately who had the power in it. He walked slowly, he looked at everything, he didn't sit until he had communicated through posture and pause. That sitting was a choice he was making rather than something the situation had required of him. He came into the boarding house at mid-morning on the 9th day with two men behind him who were not there for decoration. Gideon was alone in the front room. Eleanor was in the kitchen. Gideon heard the door and came out from behind the desk, and when he saw who it was, his expression didn't change, but something behind it recalibrated. "Hale," he said. "Cross." Victor Hale looked around the front room as he always did, assessing, calculating, finding the smallest way to signal that he found it lacking. "Place smells different. New cook." He settled into the good chair in the corner without being invited to, which was standard Hale behavior. The two men with him stayed near the door. "I'll get to the reason I'm here. Please do." "I need 4 rooms for the duration of the season. My surveyors are coming up from the South Camp and they'll need housing for 6 to 8 weeks. I'll want them here. Central. Convenient." "I have 2 rooms available," Gideon said. Victor Hale looked at him with mild patience. "I said 4. "I know what you said. I have 2 available. The other 8 are occupied or allocated." "Then unallocate 2 of them." The kitchen had gone quiet behind the wall. Gideon didn't look toward it. "I can't do that," he said. "I have agreements with the men in those rooms." Hale leaned back slightly in the chair. He had a particular expression for moments like this. Not angry, exactly, more like someone tolerating a misunderstanding that the other person will eventually correct. "Cross, I represent this company that employs 60% of the working men in this settlement. I think you understand the relationship between the company's goodwill and the well-being of a business like yours." "I understand it." "Then you understand—" "I understand it," Gideon said again, and the repetition had a quality to it this time that was different from the first time. "I understand it completely, and my answer is still the same. I have 2 rooms available. If you want 2 rooms, I'll hold them. If you need 4, you'll need to find 2 somewhere else." The room was quiet. One of the two men by the door shifted his weight slightly. Hale stayed completely still for a long moment. "You're sure about that?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Gideon said. Hale stood up from the chair with the slow deliberateness of someone who wants the act of standing to communicate something. "I'll be in touch," he said, and it landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. Completely quiet on the surface, but you know something is moving underneath. He left. His men followed him. The door shut. The silence after they left had a different texture than regular silence. Gideon stood in the middle of the front room and let it settle. His hands were completely still at his sides. His face was difficult to read, but it was the face of a man who had made a decision and knew what it was going to cost and had made it anyway. Eleanor appeared in the doorway to the kitchen. She had heard everything. Of course she had. The kitchen wall wasn't thick. She was holding a dish towel in one hand in a way that suggested she'd come to the doorway in the middle of doing something and stopped. She looked at him. "How bad is he?" she said. Gideon turned slightly toward her. "Bad," he said simply. "How much can he actually do?" Gideon considered the question, not the answer. He already knew the answer. He was considering how much to say. "He controls the company contracts," he said. "Every supplier who sells to the mines goes through him. Every mine payroll goes through him. If he decides to make your life difficult in this town, he has instruments to do that." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Has he used them before? On other businesses?" "The family that ran the dry goods store before Devlin's. They pushed back on a pricing arrangement he wanted. They were gone by the following spring." She turned this over. You could see her doing it, not the anxiety of it, but the calculation of it, measuring the scope of the thing. "You knew that when you said no to him," she said. Gideon looked at her. "Yes." "Why did you say no?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind pushed at the building, and the sign above the boarding house creaked once on its mount. "Because I already had agreements with the men in those rooms," he said. "And I'm not in the business of breaking agreements when someone more powerful walks through the door and asks me to." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression that was hard to name. Not admiration exactly, or not just that. More like recognition, like she was seeing something she hadn't expected to find here and was recalibrating around it. She turned back to the kitchen. "I'll start on the noon meal," she said. Over the following days, she watched the town the way she watched a kitchen, looking for the logic of it, mapping out what connected to what. She was not naturally a person who made conversation easily, but she was a person who listened well, and in a small settlement in the middle of a hard winter, people talked. The men who came in for meals talked. The women who came to the door asking about laundry or asking if there were any rooms available talked. Clarence Mudd from the feed stall walked by sometimes on his way to Devlin's and stopped to lean on the porch rail and talk at whoever was nearest. She listened. She learned that Black Hollow had 3 major mine operations. The Consolidated Company's 2 deep shaft mines on the North Ridge, a smaller independent operation called the Hartley Claim on the east face, and a worked-out claim near the south that a man named Porter ran with 4 hired men doing extraction work that barely covered his costs. She learned that the Consolidated Company had been buying up debt in the settlement for 2 years, quietly, through an intermediary, and that several of the businesses and several of the miners' family homes had mortgages that were now, in some technical sense, held by or connected to the company. She learned that Gideon's boarding house was not under that debt. He had bought it outright, with his own money, with no financing from any local source, which was why Victor Hale's leverage over him was indirect. Social and economic pressure rather than the more direct instrument of debt. It made Gideon's position unusual in Black Hollow. It made it paradoxically both stronger and more exposed. Stronger because there was nothing Hale could foreclose on. More exposed because a man operating without the leverage of debt was also operating without the protection of the network that debt created. The men who owed the company money had to stay in the company's good graces. They had reasons to cooperate. Gideon had none of those reasons, which meant he also had none of that cover. "I was out in the open." She turned this over in her mind while she worked. She had learned, and this was a lesson that had come from harder experience than she would have wished, that the difference between a solvable problem and an unsolvable one was usually not the size of the opposing force, but the architecture of it. Where were the load-bearing points? What would collapse if you removed it? She didn't say any of this to Gideon, not yet. She was still in the mapping phase.
But widziałem chłopa.
On the evening of this 14th day, she was in the kitchen after the dinner service, washing down the work surface and reviewing in her mind what she needed to order from Devlin's in the morning, when she heard a sound from outside the back of the building. She went still. It came again, a scraping, low and irregular, from the direction of the woodpile. She picked up the kitchen lamp and went to the back door and opened it. A man was sitting on the ground against the woodpile with his back against the logs and his knees drawn up and his head dropped down. He was dressed for the mine, heavy work jacket, thick trousers, and there was blood on the left side of his face from a cut above his ear that had stopped bleeding but had run down his jaw and dried there. He was conscious, but barely, his breathing shallow and effortful. He was maybe 22 years old. She didn't recognize him. "Hey," she said. Not loud. Steady. He lifted his head. His eyes tried to focus on her. He started, and then stopped. "Can you stand?" He tried. Got halfway up, then his legs went and he sat back down hard against the woodpile. She went back into the kitchen and got the second lamp and set both lamps at the back door to give herself light, and then she went out to him and crouched down. "What happened?" she said. "The mine." He said it like it explained everything, which in Black Hollow it did. A section had come down in the east shaft. She'd find out the details later. He'd been near it. The cut on his head was from flying timber. He'd walked down from the mine on his own, which was the only reason he was still coherent, and he'd made it as far as the back of the boarding house, and then his legs had made the decision for him. "Is anyone coming for you?" she said. "Is anyone else hurt?" "2 others," he said. "Worse. They're still up there." She stood up. She went back into the kitchen, and she stood there for exactly 4 seconds, measuring what she had and what she would need, and then she went to the stairs and raised her voice. "Gideon." What happened next was not organized exactly, but it was fast. Gideon came down. She told him what she had. He went out the front door to find the mine foreman and the doctor. Eleanor went to the kitchen and started heating water and pulling together what she had for wound cleaning. She'd found some carbolic when she reorganized the storeroom, pushed to the back behind a can of lamp oil. And she got the young miner into the kitchen and onto a stool near the stove. His name was Cal. He was 21, not 22. He'd been working the east shaft for 4 months. His hands, she noticed while she was cleaning the cut on his head, were already the hands of someone older. Rough, cracked in the cold, the knuckles thick. "Does this hurt?" she said, pressing gently around the cut. "Yeah," he said. "Good. That means the shock is wearing off." She kept working. "The other 2, where would they bring them when they come down?" "Doctors, usually." "Harlow?" That was what people called the Dr. Barber. She'd heard the name. "Yeah." "Is Harlow good?" Cal was quiet for a second. "He's good enough," he said, which she'd learned was how people in Black Hollow expressed moderate confidence in anything. Gideon came back with Harlow 40 minutes later, and the other 2 injured miners came in from the mine an hour after that, carried by 3 of their co-workers. She gave up the 2 available rooms without being asked and helped Harlow set up what he needed. He was competent, she saw immediately, whatever the local skepticism about him, and she kept the stove going and the water hot through the night and made coffee that stayed available in the front room for anyone who needed it. At some point past midnight, she sat down in the chair in the front room with a mug of coffee, and she realized she had no idea what time it was. Her feet hurt. Her back hurt. The lamp on the desk had burned down far enough that the room was mostly shadows. Gideon came in from upstairs and looked at her. She looked at him. "How are the other 2?" she said. "1 broken rib, possible 2, 1 bad cut on the arm. Harlow stitched it. They'll both be able to walk in a few days." She nodded, drank some of the coffee. Gideon sat down in the chair on the other side of the desk. He didn't say anything for a while. The building was quiet around them, the kind of quiet that comes after a long, concentrated effort, when the intensity has broken and left a wide stillness behind it. "You should sleep," he said finally. "I will." "You've been running for 6 hours." 7, she said. Then, "The flour order needs to go in tomorrow. I'll write it out before Devlin's opens." Gideon looked at her. "Eleanor." She looked back at him. He seemed to be trying to find something to say. Not a thank you exactly, because that felt inadequate, but something that acknowledged what had just happened. The way she'd moved through the last several hours without panic, without theatrics, as if the situation had required a certain thing of her and she'd simply provided it. He didn't find the right words. "The flower order," she said again, quietly, and stood up and went upstairs. 3 days later, the miners from the East Shaft, Cal and the others, and a few more who'd heard about the room and the coffee and the woman at Cross's who'd been up all night with the injured, started dropping by the boarding house in the evenings. Not to cause trouble, not, mostly, to drink, though some of them got coffee that was strong enough to qualify. They came because it had become the kind of place where a man coming off a hard shift could sit for a while without being sold something or being pushed to spend money he didn't have, which was the primary model of hospitality in the other two establishments in Black Hollow. Eleanor watched this happen. She noted it. She filed it away in the part of her mind that was still quietly working on the architecture of the problem. Victor Hale had not been back, but she knew, the way she'd known, standing in doorways of other difficult places and other difficult times, that the silence wasn't the end of something. It was the space before something else began. Outside, winter had deepened. The mountain road down to the lower settlements had been reported impassable for 2 days. The temperature at night was cold enough to freeze the water in the troughs before morning. Black Hollow had closed in on itself, the way mountain settlements do in the worst of winter. There was no getting out. There was no getting in. Whatever was coming would arrive in the spring, most likely. Or it would arrive sooner. She wasn't sure which she expected yet. She kept watching. She kept measuring. And every morning at 5:30 she was in the kitchen, and the boarding house smelled of coffee and fresh bread, and the men came down the stairs toward that smell like they were following something they hadn't known they were missing. The flower order went in on time. Devlin, who ran the supply store with the particular brand of exhausted efficiency that came from being the only supply store within 30 miles, had looked at Eleanor's list with raised eyebrows. Not because anything on it was unusual, but because of the quantities. She was ordering like someone preparing for a siege rather than a boarding house feeding 6 men. "You sure about these numbers?" he said. "Yes," she said. "That's a lot of dried beans."
I know what it is.
He filled the order without further comment, because Eleanor Vale had, in the 2 weeks since she'd arrived, developed a reputation in Devlin's store for knowing exactly what she wanted and not being interested in discussing it. He'd learned this on her 3rd visit, when he'd tried to suggest a substitution for an item he was low on, and she had looked at him with an expression that communicated, politely but completely, that she had already considered and rejected that substitution before she walked through the door. She carried the heavier sacks herself. Devlin watched her go and then went back to his accounts, shaking his head at nothing in particular. What she was doing, though nobody in Black Hollow had the full picture yet, was building a reserve. She had been watching the supply patterns for 2 weeks. She watched what came in on the wagons from the lower settlements, what Devlin moved through the store, what the mine camp kitchens were going through. She watched the sky, too, not with any particular expertise in weather reading, but with the practical attention of someone who had learned that when the sky looked a certain way over the North Ridge, you had maybe 4 days before the road situation changed significantly. The sky had been looking that way for 3 days. She didn't tell Gideon all of this. Some of it she told him plainly. The reserve building, the reasoning behind it. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to rely on about him. He didn't fill silences with his own voice just to fill them. "How bad do you think it'll get?" he said when she finished. "I don't know exactly. Bad enough that the supply wagons won't run for at least 2 weeks, maybe 3. Devlin will have his own reserve. Devlin's reserve is what it is. It's sized for normal demand. If the road closes for 3 weeks and the outer camp kitchens run low, his store gets stripped in a few days." Gideon looked at her. "So you're building insurance?" "I'm building options," she said. "Insurance is passive. Options are something you use." He was quiet for a moment, then, "What do you need from me?" "Storage space. The back room off the kitchen. It's not being used for anything." "It's yours." She went back to work. The snow came 4 days later, and it came with conviction. It started in the early morning hours, a gray shift in the air pressure that Cal noticed when he stepped outside before dawn and came back in, saying the sky felt wrong. By mid-morning, the first flakes had started, light and casual, the kind that makes people say it won't amount to much. By early afternoon, the light was gone and the wind had picked up from the northwest, and the snow was no longer casual about anything. By evening, Black Hollow had disappeared, not literally. The buildings were still there, the lights were still on, The saloons were doing a brisk business for the simple reason that nobody wanted to sit in a cold room alone while the storm pressed on the walls. But the sense of connection to anything beyond the settlement had been cut. The road south was invisible under 2 feet of new snow, with more coming. The mine operations had shut down for the day. The shaft crew foreman had made that call at noon, because you didn't run men into a deep shaft in conditions like this if you wanted to get them back out. The settlement had pulled in on itself and was waiting. The boarding house was full. All 10 rooms were occupied now, she'd quietly noted, about a week after the night with Cal and the injured miners. The 2 of Gideon's previously empty rooms had filled without any particular announcement, men who'd been sleeping at the mine camp deciding, for reasons they'd expressed vaguely as being about convenience, to take a room in town. The dining table that had seated 6 comfortably was now seating 10 with some compression, and Eleanor had begun staggering the meal service so that it didn't require everyone to sit at the same time. On the second day of the storm, 3 men appeared at the front door of the boarding house. Not residents, miners from the outer camp who'd come down before the road got completely impassable and had nowhere specific to go. They weren't asking for rooms. They knew the house was full. They were just standing on the porch in the storm, looking like men trying to figure out what their next move was. Gideon opened the door and looked at them. They looked back at him. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Fletcher, who had the calloused hands and the particular squinting expression of someone who had spent years looking at things in poor underground light, said, "We heard the house might have food." Gideon held the door open. "Come in out of the cold," he told Eleanor. She looked at the 3 men standing in the front room with snow still melting off their jackets. And she didn't say anything about the calculation she'd made when she built the reserve, or the margin she'd built into it, or the fact that she'd known something like this was probable when she ordered those extra sacks of dried beans. She just said, "Dinner's in an hour. Find somewhere to sit." Fletcher looked around the front room and then looked at her. He was a man of approximately 40 who had clearly not been in the habit of being organized by anyone, and for a moment he seemed to be deciding how he felt about being organized by this particular person in this particular tone. He must have decided he was fine with it, because he sat down. The other 2 sat down. An hour later, 12 men sat at and around the long table and ate a bean and dried meat stew with the bread Eleanor made every morning without exception. And nobody complained about the stew being simple, because it was hot and it was plentiful, and the alternative was sitting in a tent at the mine camp with the storm doing what it was doing outside. Fletcher ate 2 bowls. He didn't say anything to Eleanor about it directly, but when he carried his bowl back to the kitchen door, which none of the regular residents did, they just left things on the table. She looked at him and he gave a brief nod that communicated something between acknowledgement and a kind of rough gratitude that a man like Fletcher probably deployed rarely. She took the bowl and said, "Tell the others at camp, if it stays bad, there's food here." He looked at her for a second. "You sure about that?" "I built enough reserve for it." He left in the morning, back to the camp before the second wave of the storm came in. She watched him go from the kitchen window, and then she turned back to the stove. The second wave was worse than the first. It came in on the 3rd night with a wind that found every gap in the building's exterior, and there were more gaps than she'd realized, because buildings in Black Hollow were not constructed by people who had excess time or materials for thoroughness. She spent an hour on the second morning of the second wave moving through the building with rags and spare cloth, stuffing gaps. Not because Gideon asked her to, but because a building that leaked heat was a building that required more fuel to keep warm, and fuel was now something she was tracking carefully. She and Gideon worked alongside each other for most of that day, in a silence that had become, over the past 3 weeks, a comfortable working silence rather than an uncomfortable one. He took the upper floor. She took the ground floor. They met in the middle staircase, and she said, "There's a bad gap on the north wall of room 7. And he said, "I'll get it," and went back up. At some point in the afternoon, she went to the cold storage to take inventory, and he came into the kitchen and found her there, crouched in front of the shelves with a pencil and a piece of paper. "Where are we?" he said. She ran through the numbers. She had the inventory in her head before she looked at the paper, but she looked at the paper because the paper was what she could show him. They were in a reasonable position, not comfortable, reasonable. If the storm extended beyond 3 weeks, they'd need to start making tighter decisions about portions. If it extended beyond 4 weeks, they'd be in a genuinely difficult situation. "Devlin?" Gideon said. "Devlin's been getting requests from the mine camp kitchen. He's going to be moved through faster than he expected." Should we offer to share some of our reserve with him? She looked up from the paper. It was a question that surprised her, not because it was impractical. It might actually be practical, in terms of the goodwill it generated, but because it revealed something about how Gideon operated that she was still mapping. He didn't naturally think in terms of leverage. He thought in terms of neighbors. Yes, she said, but we price it fairly, not generously. We're not a charity, and we'll need what we have. Agreed. They worked out the arrangement with Devlin that same afternoon. He was grateful in the flat, non-demonstrative way of a man who didn't like owing anyone anything, which meant he expressed his gratitude by being marginally less difficult to deal with for the remainder of the storm, which was its own kind of currency. It was on the 6th day of the storm that the situation at the mine camp became genuinely bad. Fletcher came back, this time with 2 other men, and the expression on his face had changed from the rough, capable look he usually wore to something more tight, more careful. He came in and found Eleanor in the kitchen, and he said without preamble, "The camp kitchen's out of flour. We've got maybe 2 days of what we have left." "How many men in the camp?" 31. She looked at him. She did the math in her head, working through what she had, and what 31 men who worked a mine shaft required versus what 10 men in a boarding house required. "Sit down," she said. He sat at the kitchen table, so not the dining room table, the actual kitchen table, which was where she worked, and which she didn't generally invite people to sit at. He seemed to understand that this was a different kind of conversation. She laid it out for him. She told him what she had in reserve. She told him what was sustainable if she rationed it and ran a supply kitchen rather than a boarding house, cooking centrally, distributing meals twice a day, stretching the dried goods with the right combinations. She told him what it would require from the camp's side: organized distribution, no waste, men eating in rotation rather than all at once. Fletcher listened to all of it without interrupting, which she respected. "You can actually do this?" he said, when she finished. "I've done it before," she said. He didn't ask where or when. She didn't explain. It was a black hollow conversation. "What do you want for it?" he said. "Coal. The boarding house is burning through wood faster than I'd like. Your camp has a coal supply. We've got coal. Arrange a fair trade, coal for meals. Gideon handles the terms with your foreman." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was trying to figure out how someone had organized this situation so quickly and so completely, and where exactly this woman had come from, and why she was in Black Hollow, of all places. He didn't ask any of those things. "All right," he said. Gideon and the mine camp foreman worked out the coal arrangement that evening. Eleanor stayed in the kitchen and continued cooking because there was now significantly more cooking to do. But yeah. She found out about Victor Hale's involvement on day 8. It came from Howell, the hollow-cheeked man who'd been staying at the boarding house since before Eleanor arrived. He came into the kitchen while she was working and stood near the door in the way he had of communicating that he had something to say but wasn't sure he should say it, which she'd learned meant she should keep working and not look at him directly because he spoke more freely when he wasn't being watched. "Word from the south side," he said. She kept stirring. "What word?" "Hale's men have been buying up the emergency food stores, the ones the mining company held in reserve for the camp workers." He paused. "Not just buying, controlling. Won't release them without authorization from Hale himself. Foreman at the North Shaft went to request emergency release 2 days ago. Got told to put it in writing and wait." She stopped stirring. "Why?" she said. Not surprised. She'd already built Hale's behavior into her model of the situation. But she wanted to hear the mechanism. "Word is he's got a debt arrangement with 2 of the families on the south side. Something he's planning to collect when the road clears. He's using the storm." Howell shifted his weight. "Keeping people scared and hungry makes them easier to deal with, I expect." She was quiet for a moment. "Does Gideon know?" "Not yet." She set down the spoon. "Thank you, Howell." He left. She stood at the stove and looked at the wall for about 45 seconds, working through the new information and what it changed and what it didn't change and what it meant for the decisions she'd already made. Then she picked up the spoon and went back to work. She told Gideon that evening. She told him plainly, with the same direct economy she applied to everything. He listened, and she watched something move through his expression. Not surprise, but a kind of hardening. Not anger exactly. Something more structural than anger. The kind of resolve that doesn't look like much from the outside, but is very difficult to move once it's set. "He's using a natural disaster," Gideon said. "Yes." To collect on people who are already in trouble. Yes. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. The storm pressed against the building outside. Somewhere upstairs a door opened and closed. How many people are we actually feeding now? He said. Eleanor told him the number. It had grown in the past 2 days, quietly, as word of the supply kitchen had spread to the families in the settlement. The miners' wives, the children, the elderly woman named Mrs. Haas, who lived in the small house at the bend in the road, and whose husband had died the previous spring, and who had been managing on what help her neighbors could spare. Gideon looked at the number. He looked at it for a while. Keep going, he said. It was 2 words. It was also, Eleanor understood, a complete statement about who Gideon Cross was and what he was prepared to do and what it would probably cost him. She had been mapping that since the day she arrived. She thought she had a fair picture of it now. There's something else, she said. He looked at her. Hale's going to notice what we're doing here. He's going to understand what it means. We're keeping people from being dependent on him during the storm. When the road clears, he's going to come back. I know, Gideon said. We need to be ready for that. What does ready look like? She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the architecture of the problem, the load-bearing points, what held Victor Hale's power in place, and what might not hold as well as he thought it did. I don't know yet, she said. But I will. Outside, the storm was still going. The coal the mine camp had sent over was burning steadily in the stove, and the kitchen was warm. And somewhere in the building, 30-something people were sleeping and eating and waiting out the cold without owing Victor Hale a thing for any of it. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't anything close to a victory yet. But it was the first line of something. Eleanor Vale had been in enough desperate places to recognize the difference between a situation with no angles and a situation where the angles hadn't been found yet. She went back to work. The road cleared on a Tuesday. Not completely cleared was generous for what actually happened, which was that the snow compacted enough under its own weight that a wagon could push through it if the horse was strong and the driver was willing to accept some damage to the undercarriage. But the first wagon that came down from the upper pass on Tuesday morning was enough to signal that Black Hollow was connected to the rest of the world again, at least provisionally, and that signal moved through the settlement like a current. Eleanor watched it from the kitchen window. The wagon was loaded with timber supplies for the mine operation. She could tell by the shape of the load under the canvas covering. And it moved slowly, the horse working hard, the driver hunched against the cold that had not improved just because the snow had stopped falling. 2 men from the settlement walked out to meet it before it reached the main road, and she could see from their body language that they were asking about conditions on the pass, and the driver was answering in the way men answer when the news is not good, but is better than it was. She turned back to the stove. The supply kitchen had been running for 11 days. In 11 days, she had fed, at various points, somewhere between 30 and 45 people per meal. The number had fluctuated as conditions changed, and as word spread to parts of the settlement she hadn't originally accounted for. She had done it on reserves she'd built in 4 days of advance ordering, the coal for meals arrangement with the mine camp, and 2 additional trades she'd worked out during the storm. Preserved fish from a Norwegian miner named Anderson, who had a significant personal supply and was willing to trade it for consistent hot meals for himself and his partner, and a sack of dried corn that had come from an unlikely source. Mrs. Haas, the elderly widow at the bend in the road, who had more than she'd mentioned to anyone because she'd learned, in a life that had included harder winters than this one, to keep a private reserve and not discuss it. Mrs. Haas had appeared at the back door of the boarding house on day 4 of the storm. She was a small woman, somewhere past 70, with white hair pulled back severely, and the particular posture of someone who had once been taller and was displeased about the change. She had a cloth sack over one arm. She set it on the kitchen table and looked at Eleanor. Dried corn, she said. I don't need all of it. What do you want for it? Eleanor said. Mrs. Haas had looked at her with an expression that was difficult to parse. Not offended, but something. Meals, she said finally. 2 a day. And conversation occasionally. I've been alone in that house for 8 days and I'm losing my mind. Eleanor had looked at the sack and then at the old woman. Meals and conversation, she'd said. Deal. Mrs. Haas had come for meals twice a day after that, and she sat at the table and she talked, and Eleanor had listened while she worked, and what she'd learned in those conversations was more about the internal geography of Black Hollow than she'd learned in the 3 weeks prior. Mrs. Haas had been in the settlement for 9 years. She knew where every body was buried, figuratively speaking, and several literally. She knew, for instance, the exact nature of the debt arrangements Victor Hale had been building over the past 2 years. She knew which families were carrying them and for how much. She knew because her late husband had been a meticulous record keeper, and because she had not thrown away a single piece of paper he'd ever handled, roughly what the terms were. Eleanor had listened to all of this while stirring and ladling and doing the continuous physical work of running a kitchen that was feeding 40 people. She hadn't written anything down. She didn't need to. She had the kind of memory that held numbers and arrangements and the relationships between pieces of information the way a good structure holds weight, quietly, without apparent effort, until you needed it. By the time the road cleared on Tuesday, she had a reasonably complete picture of Victor Hale's operation in Black Hollow. She knew what he held. She knew what he owed. She knew where the inconsistencies were. She hadn't decided yet what to do with it. Hale came back on Thursday. He didn't come to the boarding house first. That was new. He went directly to the mine foreman's office. She heard about this from Cal, who had been working the east shaft since it reopened the day before, and had seen Hale's wagon come in, and had come to tell her with the particular urgency of a young man who had decided, somewhere during the 11 days of the storm, that Eleanor Vale was someone worth keeping informed. I was in there for 2 hours, Cal said. He was sitting at the kitchen table eating the lunch she'd put in front of him, but he was eating it distracted, which for Cal, who ate with the focused dedication of someone who had not always been sure where the next meal was coming from, was unusual. Came out looking like he'd gotten what he wanted. Did you hear anything? Some. The foreman's office doesn't have thick walls. He paused. He's moving on the debt collections, the families that owe the company. He's calling in some of the arrangements early, before spring, which was supposed to be when they came due. Eleanor kept working. Which families? Cal listed them. She recognized all 4 names. Mrs. Haas had told her about 3 of them, and the 4th she'd pieced together from other conversations. She knew their situations. She knew that 2 of them were going to have genuine difficulty meeting an early call, and that one of them, a family named Pritchard, with 4 children and a husband who'd had his hours cut at the mine in December, was going to have no way to meet it at all. What happens if they can't pay? Cal said. He already knew the answer, probably, but he was 21 and he still asked questions that older people had stopped asking because they were tired of the answers. They lose what they put up as security, she said, which in most cases is the house or the land. Cal was quiet for a moment. He pushed the food around his plate. And Hale gets the property, he said. And the company gets the property, she said. Hale gets the commission or whatever arrangement he has with his employers. It doesn't really matter which. The result for the families is the same. Can anyone stop him? Legally, I mean. Eleanor thought about that. The terms are almost certainly legal. That's how these arrangements work. They're legal at every individual step, and the problem is what they add up to. Cal looked at her. He had the frustrated expression of someone confronting a system that was operating exactly as designed and finding that intolerable. So there's nothing. I didn't say that, she said. He waited. She didn't add anything. She went back to the stove and he finished his lunch and eventually left. And she stood at the stove for a long time after that, turning something over in her mind. Gideon came in that evening to find her at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil. This was not unusual. She was often at the table with paper and pencil in the evenings, doing the kitchen accounts or making supply lists. But the piece of paper tonight was not the kitchen ledger, and she was not making lists. She was writing something in a different way, longer sentences, more deliberate, the kind of writing where you're trying to get something exact. He sat down across from her without asking what it was. He'd learned that she would tell him when she was ready, and that asking before that point was inefficient for both of them. She kept writing for a few minutes. Then she put the pencil down and looked at the paper and then at him. The debt arrangements Hale is calling in, she said. I've been going through what I know about the terms. There are inconsistencies. What kind of inconsistencies? The interest rates he's been charging don't match the standard company rates. I know what those are because the mine foreman had a copy of the standard terms posted in his office. Cal's described it to me. Hale's private arrangements are running above those rates. Gideon was still. How much above? Significantly. And there's something else. She looked at the paper again. The food supplies the company held in reserve during the storm. The emergency stores he wouldn't release without authorization. Those were company property. They belonged to the operation, not to Hale personally. He doesn't have the right to use them as personal leverage. That's a misappropriation of company assets. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. You've been building a case. I've been building a picture, she said. Whether it becomes a case depends on what can be documented. Can it be documented? She was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Haas has her husband's records. He kept everything. Correspondence, copies of agreements, a personal ledger he maintained of transactions he witnessed or was party to. Some of what's in there is going to be relevant. Gideon leaned forward slightly. Does she know that? I think she knows more than she's said directly. But yes, I think she's been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. The room was quiet for a moment. From upstairs came the low sounds of men settling in for the evening. Boots dropped, a chair scraped, the murmur of voices. Hale has a direct line to the company, Gideon said. If we go to the company with this, we don't go to the company, Eleanor said. The company is not going to police itself. They'll bury it and replace Hale with someone more careful. She paused. We go to the people Hale has used. We go to the families he's pressuring. We put the documentation in their hands and we let them see what they're actually dealing with. And then what? Gideon said. Knowing they've been defrauded doesn't clear the debt. No. But it gives them standing to refuse to pay until the terms are reviewed. It gives them a reason to ask for an independent accounting. And it changes the story from families who owe a debt they can't pay to families who were defrauded by a company agent running a personal scheme. She met his eyes. That's a different story, especially if people know it. Gideon looked at her steadily. You want to make it public. I want to make it accurate, she said. Public follows from that. He thought about it. She let him think. She didn't push, didn't add to the argument. She'd made the case as clearly as she knew how, and now it was his decision, because it was his house and his name above the door, and whatever came from this was going to land on him in ways she could anticipate but not fully absorb for him. All right, he said finally. There's risk, she said. I know there is. He's going to push back hard. I know that too. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile but had some of the same quality, dry and certain. You think I haven't thought about what I'm doing? She looked back at him. No, she said. I think you have. She picked up the pencil and went back to the paper. The next morning she went to see Mrs. Haas. The old woman's house was small and extremely organized in the way of someone who had made peace with limited space by making that space entirely deliberate. Every surface had a function. The papers her husband had kept were in a wooden box under the bed. Mrs. Haas pulled it out without being asked, which meant she'd already known this conversation was coming. I've been waiting for 9 months for someone to do something with these, Mrs. Haas said. She sat on the edge of the bed with the box on her lap. Since Hendrik died. He kept records because he said a man who keeps records can't be rewritten. I thought about going to the company myself, but I'm old and I knew they'd dismiss me and then destroy whatever I gave them. Eleanor sat in the single chair across from her. Can I look through it? Mrs. Haas handed her the box. It took 2 hours. Mrs. Haas sat and watched, and occasionally said things like, that one, the letter behind it explains the context, or Hendrik noted the date on the back. She was a precise and useful guide to her dead husband's archive, and Eleanor worked through it methodically, pulling out the relevant pieces, organizing them in her mind. What was in the box was not a complete legal case. She was not a lawyer, and she knew it, and she didn't pretend that a collection of a dead man's private records constituted formal evidence. But it was a detailed and specific record of patterns. The same names recurring, the same terms appearing across multiple agreements, the rate discrepancy visible across several documents, a letter in Hale's own handwriting that referenced the company food stores in a way that was difficult to interpret as anything other than a personal use of company assets. It was a picture, a clear one. You can take copies, Mrs. Haas said when Eleanor finished. I'll make them. I won't let the originals leave this house. I'm not foolish, but copies, yes. That's enough, Eleanor said. Mrs. Haas looked at her with those sharp, slightly narrowed eyes. What are you going to do with it? I'm going to talk to the Pritchard family first, then the others. Hale will find out. He'll find out regardless. The question is what position we're in when he does. The old woman was quiet for a moment. Where are you from, Eleanor Vale? Eleanor looked at her. It was the same question everyone in Black Hollow wanted to ask, and most had learned not to, because she did not answer it. Mrs. Haas, being 90% past the age of caring what people found impolite, had simply asked it. Eleanor considered. Somewhere that had a man very much like Victor Hale in it, she said. Mrs. Haas looked at her for a long moment. And what happened to that man? I left before I found out, Eleanor said. There was something in how she said it, a flatness that wasn't indifference, more like a door that had been carefully closed and locked. I'm not leaving this time. Mrs. Haas nodded slowly. It was the nod of someone who understood the particular mathematics of a person who has run once and decided not to run again. Right, she said. I'll start on the copies. Eleanor visited the Pritchard family that same afternoon. Margaret Pritchard was 34 and had the face of someone who had been keeping a sustained anxiety private for long enough that it had started to show around her eyes and at the corners of her mouth. She opened the door and looked at Eleanor with the cautious expression of someone who had learned that unexpected visitors usually meant bad news. Eleanor told her she was from the boarding house. Margaret let her in. They sat at the kitchen table while the 4 Pritchard children moved around the house with the controlled chaos of children who had been kept inside for weeks by the storm and were still absorbing the shock of the walls. Eleanor put the copies of the relevant documents on the table and walked Margaret through them steadily and clearly, without legal language because she didn't have any, just plain language about what the document showed and what it meant. Margaret was quiet for a long time after Eleanor finished. If this is right, she said carefully, if the rate is wrong, can they still take the house? Not without a fight, Eleanor said. Not if you refuse to accept the early call-in as legitimate and demand a review of the terms. Not if 3 other families do the same thing at the same time. The company doesn't want the visibility of forcing 4 families out of their homes on the basis of terms that are going to look like fraud when someone looks at them closely. Who's going to look at them closely? People will, Eleanor said, when they know to look. Margaret looked at the papers on the table. She had her hands flat on the table surface, pressing down slightly, the way people press down on things when they're trying to hold themselves steady. My husband is going to say this is dangerous, she said. It is, Eleanor said. I'm not going to tell you it isn't. Margaret looked at her. Then why are you doing it? Eleanor thought about the question. She could have given the practical answer, because it's the right position strategically, because the numbers support it, because Hale's leverage depends on people not understanding what they're actually facing. All of that was true, but that wasn't really why. Because he used a blizzard, she said. He let people go without food during a storm to make them easier to manage, and I was here for that. She met Margaret's eyes. I take that personally. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression. The careful neutrality of someone protecting themselves from hope, giving way, slightly, to something less guarded. I'll talk to my husband tonight, she said. By the end of the week, all 4 families had been visited. All 4 had the copies. 3 of the 4 had agreed to hold their position and refuse the early call-in. The 4th, a man named Greer, who owed the most and had the most to lose, had listened to Eleanor, and then looked at the papers, and then looked at the wall for a long time and said, I've got kids. I can't risk it. She hadn't argued with him. She'd said she understood and left the copies with him anyway, in case he changed his mind. Gideon received his own message from Hale's office that week. A written notice that his supply account with the company's associated merchant was being placed on hold, pending a review of outstanding balances. It was transparently retaliatory. Gideon had no outstanding balances, as Eleanor had confirmed multiple times from the ledger, and it was designed to signal that the pressure was coming. Gideon set the notice on the desk and looked at it for a moment. He knows we're doing something, he said. He knows something's moved, Eleanor said. He doesn't know exactly what yet. How long before he does? A week, maybe less. Gideon nodded. He didn't look frightened. He didn't look like a man about to step back from something either. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was living in it, which was different from both of those things, and Eleanor had come to understand was simply how Gideon Cross operated. What do we do in this meantime? He said. We keep the house running, she said. We keep feeding people. We keep being exactly what we've been. That's it? That's more than it sounds like. She looked at him steadily. Hale's power in this town is built on people being isolated and afraid. Every day this place is open and warm and full of people who are talking to each other, that's a day his version of things loses ground. Gideon looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the notice on the desk, picked it up, and put it in the desk drawer. "Dinner service in an hour," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm already behind." She went back to the kitchen. The fire in the stove was burning well. The coal from the mine camp arrangement had kept them through the worst of the storm, and there was still enough left to see them through to when the regular wood supply could be reliably delivered again. Small mercies, she thought. Not the word mercy exactly, but the thing itself. The practical grace of something working when it was supposed to. Outside, the mountain was still white and hard and cold. The road was passable, but barely. Spring was still weeks away, and in those weeks she knew whatever was going to happen was going to happen. She picked up the spoon and kept working. The notice from Hale's office was followed by 3 days of silence, which was worse. Eleanor knew that particular silence. She'd lived inside versions of it before. The held breath before someone with power decided how to use it. The waiting had a texture to it, almost physical, and she could feel it in the boarding house the same way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. The men noticed it too, even if they couldn't name what they were noticing. Conversations at the dinner table ran shorter. People went to bed earlier. Cal, who had developed the habit of staying after dinner to help clear the table without being asked, a habit Eleanor had never commented on, because commenting on it would have made it self-conscious, and therefore ended it, started clearing faster, like he wanted to be done and upstairs before something happened. On the 4th day, Hale moved. It didn't come as one thing. It came as several things on the same day, which was the point. Multiple pressure points activated simultaneously so that the response was forced to split itself. First, a man arrived at the boarding house in the morning claiming to be a company auditor, with a written notice that Cross Boarding House was subject to an inspection of its commercial food service operation, which the notice claimed required a separate license under company territory regulations. The notice cited a regulation number. Eleanor had Gideon read it twice while she stood at the kitchen doorway. "Is that a real regulation?" Gideon asked. "I don't know," she said. "Is he a real auditor?" The man standing in the front room had the look of someone playing a role he'd been briefed on, rather than someone who actually performed this function regularly. His jacket was right, but his hands were wrong, too rough for a man who spent his days with paperwork. "We'll need to see your original licensing documentation," the man said. "I'll get it," Gideon said, in a tone that communicated nothing about what he was thinking, and went to the desk and began very methodically going through papers. He went through them for a long time. The man stood and waited. Eleanor went back to the kitchen and made coffee that she did not offer to the auditor. By the time Gideon produced the relevant documents, and they were real, he had bought the property legitimately and had the papers to show it. The man had been standing in the front room for 40 minutes. He looked at the documents, wrote something in a small book he'd brought, and said the review would continue and they would be contacted with further requirements. He left without finding anything he could actually use, which had been the point. Not to find something, to take up time and create anxiety and signal that the machinery was in motion. The second thing came that afternoon. 2 of the 4 families Eleanor had visited sent word, not in writing, through people they trusted, that Hale's men had come to their houses. The message was the same in both cases. The company was accelerating the debt review, the early call-in stood, and any attempt to dispute the terms would result in the company pursuing full legal remedy, which in plain language meant they would take the houses without waiting for a negotiation. The third thing was that the supply arrangement with the coal camp was suddenly, with no explanation provided, suspended. The foreman sent a boy over with a note that said only that the arrangement could not continue at this time. Eleanor read the note and set it on the kitchen table and stood there for a moment. Then she went and found Gideon. "He got to the foreman," she said. Gideon's jaw tightened slightly. "How much coal do we have left?" 4 days at current use. Maybe 5 if I reduce the kitchen hours." "Don't reduce the kitchen hours." "Gideon, don't," he said. "We'll find coal somewhere else." She looked at him. He was tired. She could see it. The kind of tired that wasn't just sleep deprivation, but the sustained effort of holding a position under pressure. He hadn't slept well in a week. She knew because she hadn't either, and she heard him sometimes in the early hours moving around downstairs, checking the building, doing the small maintenance tasks that hands find to do when a mind won't quiet. "The families," she said, "the ones who got the messages today. What are they going to do?" "Margaret Pritchard sent word that they're holding," Gideon said. "The other one, Saunders. I don't know yet." She turned back to the window. Outside, the main road was visible, dirty with the gray-brown slush of late winter. the snow retreating into the shadows where the buildings blocked the sun. In 3 weeks, maybe 4, the lower pass would be clear enough for a company representative to come up from the regional office. That was Hale's real timeline, she understood. He needed to have this settled before anyone from the company's actual hierarchy arrived and started asking questions about why things in Black Hollow were the way they were. I was under his own pressure. She'd known that. Knowing it and finding a way to use it were two different things. I need to talk to Fletcher, she said. Fletcher was at the mine camp but came down when Cal brought the message, which told her something about how things had shifted since the storm. 6 weeks ago, Fletcher had been a man she didn't know existed. Now he came when she asked. He sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee he didn't drink, just held it with both hands, and listened to her lay out the situation. She told him about the auditor, the messages to the families, the coal arrangement being cut. She told him what she believed Hale's timeline was. She told him what she thought would happen if the families couldn't hold their position against the early call-in. Fletcher listened to all of it with his characteristic stillness, the kind of stillness that isn't absence of thought, but concentration of it. "What do you need?" he said, when she finished. "I need to know whether the men at the camp understand what's happening." "They understand some of it." "I need them to understand all of it," she said, "because what Hale is doing to those families is the same thing he'll do to every man at that camp if it works. If he can clear out 4 families on manufactured debt before anyone questions the terms, it tells him the model works. He'll use it again." Fletcher looked at his coffee. "The foreman shut down the coal arrangement because Hale got to him." "I know." "Most of the men don't know that's why." "Then they should know," she said. Fletcher set the mug down. He had a way of making decisions that wasn't dramatic. No visible moment of resolution, just a slight forward shift in his posture that meant something had settled. "I'll talk to them tonight," he said. "All of them?" "The ones that matter." She nodded. She knew better than to ask who that meant. Fletcher knew his own camp better than she did, and he'd been working with these men for 2 years and understood which voices carried weight. He left. She went back to the stove. The week that followed was the worst one. Hale escalated in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. Not the nature of them, because she'd anticipated the nature, but the speed. He was moving faster than she'd expected, which meant he was more worried than she'd thought, which was in one sense useful information, and in another sense an immediate problem, because a worried man with his kind of resources was more dangerous than a confident one. The supply store situation changed first. Devlin came to the boarding house on a Wednesday evening with an expression like a man delivering news. He'd rather not be delivering, and told Gideon that he'd received word that his own supply line from the lower settlement, the primary source for most of his non-local stock, was going to be restructured through a new company-affiliated distributor, effective immediately. The restructuring would increase his costs and reduce his margins, and was designed to do both of those things, and everyone in the room understood that. Devlin sat down heavily in one of the front room chairs. He was a practical man, not a courageous one, and he looked like the practical calculations were running badly. "I can't absorb that increase," he said, "not on current volume." "How long can you hold?" Gideon said. Devlin looked at the floor. 2 months. Maybe. After that I start selling at a loss. Eleanor came to the doorway of the kitchen. She'd been listening. "Does anyone else in the settlement know about the restructuring?" "I don't know who else he's told." "He's told other people," she said. It wasn't a guess. "He's telling everyone at the same time. He wants the settlement to feel the squeeze all at once, so the pressure is everywhere." Devlin looked up at her. "What do we do?" "You don't do anything alone," she said. "None of us do. That's the point." She said it simply, without drama, but something in the directness of it landed in the room in a way that made both men look at her with slightly different attention. It was Mrs. Haas who suggested the meeting. She came for her evening meal on Thursday. She still came twice a day, which had become a fixed point in Eleanor's schedule that she'd stopped thinking of as an arrangement and started thinking of as simply true, the way certain things become true, through repetition. And after she ate, she sat with her hands folded on the table and said, "You need to get everyone in the same room." Eleanor was washing up at the basin. "I know, not everyone will come. I know that too. But enough will." Mrs. Haas looked at her steadily. "This settlement is full of people who have been managing their problems alone because they thought their problems were their own. They need to see that they're not." Eleanor turned from the basin. "Hale will find out about a meeting before it happens." Yes, the old woman said. So you use that. You let him know you're calling a meeting, and then you watch what he does. What he does in response will tell you what he's most afraid of. Eleanor looked at her for a moment. Mrs. Haas had spent 9 years watching Black Hollow from her house at the bend in the road, and she had Hendrick's records in her own memory and a mind that had apparently lost none of its sharpness to age. You've been thinking about this for a long time, Eleanor said. Since my husband died, Mrs. Haas said simply. I just didn't have anyone to think with. The meeting was set for Saturday evening at the boarding house. Eleanor told Gideon, and Gideon told the men who were staying at the house, and Fletcher told the men at the mine camp, and Margaret Pritchard told the settlement families. And somehow, in the way that information moves through a small, isolated community, when the information is about something that concerns everyone, it reached essentially everyone in Black Hollow within 48 hours. Hale's response came in 36. He sent a written message to Gideon, not through an intermediary this time, directly, stating that any organized gathering intended to interfere with legitimate company business operations would be considered a breach of the settlement's operating agreement and could result in consequences including restriction of mining licenses for any men who participated. It was a threat designed to reach the miners specifically because their livelihoods depended on their licenses. Gideon read the message and handed it to Eleanor without comment. She read it. She thought about what Mrs. Haas had said. She thought about the specific nature of the threat. Mining licenses, not the debt, not the supply arrangements. Licenses. He's scared of the miners, she said. Gideon looked at her. What? The debt arrangements and the supply squeeze. Those are things he can manage with the families and the merchants. But the miners are different. They're the labor. Without the labor, there's no extraction. And without extraction, the company has nothing up here. He doesn't control the licenses. The company does. And he can threaten to pull them, but pulling them costs the company its production. She turned the message over in her hands. He's not actually going to pull mining licenses. He can't. It would cost the company more than anything we're doing costs him. Gideon was very still. So the threat is empty. It's not entirely empty. He could make the license renewal process difficult, expensive, delayed, but it's not the weapon he wants us to think it is. Gideon looked at the message and then looked at her. We should tell the miners that. We're going to tell everyone that, she said. Saturday. Saturday came with thin, cold sunlight and the smell of late winter giving way to something that wasn't quite spring but was heading there. The snow on the main road had retreated to the edges and the mud underneath had emerged, rutted and dark. And there was a drip from the eaves of the boarding house all morning that Eleanor heard from the kitchen while she was cooking. She cooked all day. She cooked not because a crisis required bread and soup, but because she understood. And this was something she'd learned in harder circumstances and in harder rooms, that people make better decisions when they are not hungry and cold. They think more clearly. They are less susceptible to fear. It was a small thing and a practical thing, and she did it with the same undramatic attention she gave everything else. By early evening, the boarding house was full in a way it had never been. Not just the residents. The Pritchard family came, all 6 of them, the children wide-eyed and containing themselves with the effort of children who have been told this is important and have taken that seriously. Fletcher came with 7 men from the mine camp. Devlin came. Mrs. Haas came early and sat in the best chair near the stove as if she'd always occupied it. Cal was there, standing near the wall with his arms crossed, and that particular expression of young men who are trying to look older than they are because the situation seems to require it. In total, 31 people were inside the boarding house, and several more stood on the porch because there was no more room, and Gideon had left the front door open so the porch could hear. Eleanor stood at the front of the room. She had not prepared a speech. She didn't work that way. She had prepared information, organized in the order she was going to present it, and she stood up and presented it the way she did everything. Directly, without preamble, without performance. She went through the debt arrangements first. She explained what she'd found in Hendrik Haas's records, the rate discrepancies, the documentation. She didn't use language that required a legal education. She used numbers because numbers were plain and specific and didn't require interpretation. She told them what the standard company rate was and what Hale had been charging and let the room do the arithmetic. The room did the arithmetic. She could hear it happening, the shift in breathing, the quality of the silence changing. Then she explained the food supply situation during the storm. She explained what the emergency stores were and who they belonged to and what Hale had done with them and why that mattered legally and practically. Then she talked about the mining license threat. She was careful here. She didn't tell them the threat was nothing, because that wasn't entirely true. She told them what the threat could actually do and what it couldn't do and why the distinction mattered. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Fletcher spoke first, which she hadn't expected but probably should have. "What do we do?" he said. It was the same question he'd asked her in the kitchen, direct and without decoration. "The families refused the early call-in," she said, in writing, citing the rate discrepancy. All three families together, not one at a time. Together, so that what Hale has to respond to is not three individual disputes but one collective challenge to his accounting. She looked at Margaret Pritchard. Margaret was sitting with her hands in her lap and her back straight in a way that communicated effort. "It's your decision," Eleanor said. "It has to be." Margaret looked at her husband beside her. He was a quiet man, shorter than his wife, with the face of someone who had absorbed a lot of bad news in his life with minimal complaint. He gave a small nod. "We'll sign it," Margaret said. The second family, Saunders, who had received the threatening message, took longer. Robert Saunders sat with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and for a moment Eleanor thought he was going to refuse, and she had already decided she wasn't going to push him, because a man protecting his family from an outcome he considered catastrophic did not need to be pushed, he needed to be heard. "If this goes wrong," Saunders said, "I lose everything I have." "I know," Eleanor said. "You don't lose anything." The room was very quiet. It was a fair point, and she didn't pretend it wasn't. "No," she said. "I don't. I'm not going to stand here and tell you the risk is equal, because it isn't." She met his eyes. "What I can tell you is that if you refuse to dispute this and pay what Hale says you owe on terms he invented, you're going to lose the house anyway. Just more slowly, and for reasons everyone will call legitimate." Saunders uncrossed his arms. His hands were in his lap now, and he was looking at the floor. His wife, sitting beside him, reached over without looking at him and put her hand over his. "All right," he said finally. "We'll sign." Gideon drafted the letter that evening, after everyone had gone. He sat at the desk with the lamp and the paper, and Eleanor sat across from him, and they worked through it together. Him writing, her reviewing, both of them finding the right words with the same practical precision they'd applied to everything else since she'd arrived. It took 2 hours. There were 3 drafts. The third draft said what needed to be said clearly and specifically, and without language that would be easy to dismiss or misrepresent. 3 copies were made, one for each family to sign and send, one for the boarding house records. When it was done, Gideon set down the pen and looked at the letter for a moment. "He's going to come here," he said. "When he gets this, he's going to come here first." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Then we should be ready for that." She thought about what ready meant in this specific context. She thought about what the letter would do when Hale received it. Not just the content of it, but the fact of 3 signatures together. The fact that it existed at all, that it had been drafted and signed and delivered rather than quietly not done, which was what Hale had been counting on. She thought about what Mrs. Haas had said. "A man who keeps records can't be rewritten." "Pull everything together," she said to Gideon. "Every document. The letter, the copies of Hendrick's records, the kitchen ledger from the storm showing who we fed and when, the note Hale sent about the meeting, the notice from the auditor." She paused. "When he comes here, I don't want him to be the one with the paper. I want us to be." Gideon looked at her. In the lamplight, his face was tired and certain in equal measure. "You're going to do it in public," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd been working toward the same conclusion from a different direction. "If he comes here where people can see," she said. "That's what he's been counting on us to avoid. That's what he doesn't understand about this place." She looked out the window at the dark main road. "He thinks Black Hollow is just the company's territory. He doesn't understand that it's people's home." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he folded the letter with careful hands and set it at the edge of the desk. "The morning," he said. "We deliver the copies in the morning." "In the morning," she agreed. She went upstairs. He was exhausted in a way that went to the bottom of everything. The weeks of the storm, the cooking, the mapping, and the planning, and the constant vigilance of watching for the next thing Hale would do and the next after that. Her feet hurt. Her right hand was stiff from the cold in a way that had become chronic. She sat on the edge of the bed in her small room at the end of the corridor and looked at the floor for a while. The window gap she'd stuffed with cloth on her second day was still holding. The room was cold, but not intolerable. Outside, the mountain was dark and still. For the first time in weeks, the wind had completely stopped, and the silence it left was so complete that she could hear the building settling around her, the small creaks and shifts of a structure that had been standing through hard winters for years and intended to keep standing. She lay down without changing anything and closed her eyes. She was asleep in 4 minutes. Hale arrived the following Tuesday. He arrived early, before 6 in the morning, before the breakfast service, before most of the settlement was moving, with 4 men, not 2, and the specific quality of urgency that belongs to a person who has received a piece of paper and decided that the paper requires an immediate physical response. Eleanor was already in the kitchen. She heard the horses and looked out the window and counted the men and went to the stairs. Gideon. He appeared at the top of the stairs within 30 seconds, which meant he hadn't been fully asleep either. He looked down at her. How many? He said. 4 plus Hale. He came down the stairs. She went back to the kitchen and took off her apron and then reconsidered and put it back on, because the apron was accurate to the situation, and she wasn't going to change herself to match Hale's expectation of what this moment should look like. Hale didn't knock. He tried the door. It was unlocked, because they'd agreed to leave it unlocked, and came in, and his 4 men came in behind him, and the front room, which had been quiet and dim a minute ago, was suddenly loud with their presence. Gideon was at the desk. He stood when they entered, but he didn't move from behind the desk. Hale looked at him with an expression past patience. You know why I'm here. I assume it's about the letter, Gideon said. It's about the letter and about whatever you've been doing in this town for the past 3 weeks, and about the fact that you seem to have forgotten how things work up here. Hale stepped forward. His voice was controlled, but the control was covering something underneath it that was less controlled. I'm giving you one opportunity to walk this back. Advise the families to withdraw the dispute. Shut down whatever operation you've been running here, and we'll consider this a misunderstanding. Gideon looked at him for a moment. No, he said. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. Same as the first time weeks ago. Just no. Flat and final and without the decoration of explanation. Hale's expression changed. The patience, already thin, went away entirely. Then you're going to watch this establishment get taken apart piece by... There are people outside, Eleanor said. She was standing in the doorway to the kitchen. She said it conversationally, as if it was information he might find relevant. Hale turned to look at her, then looked toward the front window. On the main road outside the boarding house, in the early cold of a Tuesday morning, people were standing. Not a crowd, not all at once. They were arriving in the way people arrive when word has moved through a small settlement and been taken seriously, in ones and twos coming from different directions, stopping at the edge of the boarding house lot and staying there. Fletcher was there, and 6 of his mine camp men. The Pritchard family. Devlin, standing with his hands in his coat pockets. Mrs. Haas, which was remarkable because she had come from the far end of the road on a cold morning and was standing in the mud without any apparent difficulty. Cal was there, and several of the boarding house residents, and other faces Eleanor recognized from the weeks of the supply kitchen and the storm. They weren't doing anything. They weren't shouting or blocking the road or carrying anything. They were simply standing there, visible, present, bearing witness to whatever was happening inside. Hale looked at them through the window. Something moved through his face. Eleanor came out of the kitchen doorway, and she had the documents in her hand, the organized stack she and Gideon had assembled. She put them on the desk in front of Gideon with the deliberateness that Hale could see clearly. We have the rate documentation, she said. We have copies of the agreements as written against the company's stated standard terms. We have records of the emergency food stores and how they were used during the storm. She paused. We have a room full of people outside who were here for all of it and know exactly what happened. Hale looked at the documents. He looked at the window. He looked at Gideon, who was standing behind the desk with the patient, settled expression of a man who had made a decision and was done reconsidering it. Then he looked at Eleanor. She met his gaze and held it. She had stood in front of harder men than Victor Hale in harder rooms than this one, and she knew the specific look of a man who was calculating whether he could still win this and finding the answer coming up short. This isn't over, he said. I know, she said. But today it is. Hale stood very still for a moment. Then he straightened. in the way a man straightens when he is preparing to leave a room and wants to be the one who appears to have chosen to leave it. He left. His men followed. Eleanor watched through the window as they walked to the horses. She watched Hale stop at the edge of the road, where the people of Black Hollow were still standing. He looked at them. They looked back. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. After a long moment, he walked to his horse and mounted it and rode south without looking back. The people on the road watched him go. Then Fletcher looked toward the window of the boarding house and raised one hand, not a wave exactly, more like an acknowledgement. Eleanor raised hers back. Gideon exhaled beside her. It came out slow and long, the breath of a man releasing something he'd been holding for weeks. "Is it done?" he said. Eleanor watched the last of Hale's men disappear down the road. "For now," she said, because she knew, she'd always known, that men like Hale didn't disappear when you beat them. They regrouped. They reconsidered. Sometimes, if the damage was sufficient and visible enough, they moved on to easier ground. She thought the damage was sufficient. She thought it was visible enough. She turned from the window and went back to the kitchen because it was past 5:30 and breakfast didn't make itself. The days after Hale rode south were strange, in the way that days after a sustained crisis are always strange. The pressure had been present for so long that its absence felt like a physical thing, a hollow where something solid had been. People moved through Black Hollow a little differently. Conversations ran longer. Men who had been walking with their heads down and their shoulders up against something invisible walked straighter. But Eleanor didn't trust it. She went about her work with the same discipline she'd maintained through the worst weeks. The 5:30 start, the breakfast service, the kitchen accounts in the evening. She watched the road south. She watched the faces of the men who came in for meals, reading them the way she read weather, looking for the particular tightness around the eyes that meant someone had heard something. What she was watching for was the company. Hale was an agent. He had employers. Those employers had received the collective dispute letter from the three families, had received the documentation of the rate discrepancies, and had received, she assumed, because word moved down the mountain the same way it moved through the settlement, some version of what had happened on Tuesday morning outside the boarding house. What the company chose to do with all of that was the question she couldn't answer yet, and it was the only question left that mattered. Gideon asked her about it on the Thursday after Hale's departure. They were at the desk after dinner, the lamp between them, going through the week's accounts. The boarding house was running better than it ever had. All 10 rooms occupied, the meal service pulling in steady income from the mine camp arrangement, which had quietly resumed after Hale left, the foreman apparently having concluded that his arrangement with the company agent was no longer worth the particular awkwardness of maintaining it. "What happens if the company decides to push?" Gideon said. He wasn't asking from fear. She knew his tone well enough now to know the difference. I was asking the way a practical man asks about weather, not hoping it won't rain, just wanting to know if he needs a coat. "They could," she said. "The legitimate parts of the debt arrangements are still legally valid. The rate discrepancy gives the families grounds to dispute, but it doesn't eliminate what they owe. It just changes the number." So the families could still lose their houses. If the company pressed a legal case, yes. But that's an expensive process and a visible one. And right now this situation has visibility. She looked at the lamp rather than at him, thinking through it. The company's interest is in productive mines and stable labor. What Hale built up here served his personal interest, not the company's. When they look at the actual picture, mines that are running well, a labor force that isn't in crisis, the PR situation of pressing legal action against families in a dispute that involves documented rate fraud, the calculation probably doesn't favor pressing. "Probably," Gideon said. "Probably," she agreed. "I can't give you certainty. I never could." He was quiet for a moment. "Has anyone actually reached the company directly? Anyone with authority?" She'd been thinking about that. "Not yet." "Should someone?" She looked at him. "Are you asking if you should?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm asking what you think." She thought about it. She thought about the architecture of the problem, which was, she had learned over the past weeks, the way she always thought about problems, mapping the load-bearing points, finding what held things up, and what might not hold. The company's decision would come down to whoever reviewed the situation at the regional level, and that person would see the documents and draw conclusions. But documents alone were static. They told what had happened, not what the settlement was now and what pressing legal action would cost in terms of labor stability. Someone should write to the regional office, she said finally, not to argue, to describe what the settlement looks like now, what the labor situation is, what the mine production numbers are. Make the case that stability here serves their interests. She paused. Not from me, from the foreman and from Fletcher. Men with standing in the operation. Gideon considered that. Will they do it? I think Fletcher will. The foreman, he'll need convincing. He's embarrassed about the coal arrangement. Embarrassed men sometimes go one of two ways. They retreat further, or they do something to correct themselves. Which way do you think he'll go? I'm going to find out tomorrow, she said. The foreman's name was Hartwell. He was a compact, precise man in his late 40s who had run mining operations in 3 different territories and had the weathered, particular competence of someone who understood extraction work at a technical level that went well beyond most of the men who worked for him. He had cooperated with Hale's suspension of the coal arrangement because Hale had leverage over his own contract renewal, and he had known when he did it that it was the wrong call, and that knowledge had been sitting in him like a bad tooth for the 3 weeks since. Eleanor found him at the mine foreman's office on Friday morning. She knocked. He opened the door and looked at her with the expression of a man who had been expecting this conversation and wasn't sure he was ready for it. Come in, he said. She came in. She sat in the chair across from his desk. He sat down and looked at his hands for a moment and then looked at her. The coal arrangement, he said. I'm not here about that, she said. He looked slightly surprised. I'm here because the company is going to make a decision about the debt situation, and they're going to make it based on whatever picture they have of this settlement. Right now, the picture they have is the one Hale gave them, plus the dispute letter. She met his eyes. They need to hear from someone who runs the operation. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. You want me to write to regional? I want you to tell the truth about what the operation looks like and what stability here is worth to the company. He looked at her for a long time. She waited. Hale had connections at regional, he said. He wasn't just an agent, he had relationships up there. I know, she said, but Hale is not in Black Hollow anymore, and the documentation we have is specific and detailed, and it's not going to get less specific with time. His connections are going to be calculating their own exposure right now, not his. Something moved through Hartwell's face, recognition, maybe, of a logic he'd already been running privately and was relieved to hear articulated. What should I say? He said. Exactly what's true, she said. Nothing more complicated than that. He wrote the letter that afternoon. Fletcher signed it alongside him, which Eleanor had asked Cal to facilitate, and Cal had done it with the quiet efficiency he was developing in everything he put his hands to. The letter went south with the next reliable wagon on Saturday morning. 3 weeks passed. They were not easy weeks, but they were functional ones, the kind of weeks that feel ordinary when you're inside them and significant when you look back. The mine operations ran steadily. The boarding house filled every night. Eleanor expanded the meal service to include a late breakfast for the overnight mine shift, which meant she was up at 4:30 some mornings. And on those mornings, Gideon came downstairs without being asked and made the coffee, which he made badly but made consistently, and she drank it without comment. The Pritchard family held their position. The Saunders held theirs. The third family, a young couple named Waite, who had been the quietest of the 3 throughout the whole process, held theirs too, and Mrs. Waite came to the boarding house one evening with a jar of preserved plums she'd made in the fall and set it on the kitchen table and said, I don't know how to say thank you properly. And Eleanor said, You held your position. That's the thank you. And Mrs. Waite looked at her for a moment and then went home. Greer, the 4th family who had declined to sign the letter, had not lost his house. Hale's departure had left the early call-in in legal limbo, and whatever the company eventually decided about the debt arrangements, the acceleration of the timeline appeared to have died with Hale's presence in the settlement. Greer came to the boarding house once, in the 2nd week after Hale left, and sat in the front room and told Gideon he was sorry he hadn't signed. Gideon told him there was nothing to apologize for. Greer looked like a man who was going to go on apologizing privately for some time regardless. Eleanor heard this from the kitchen. She thought about it while she worked. She thought about the Greers of every difficult situation, the people who calculated the risk correctly, who understood the cost, who chose protection over exposure and could not be blamed for it. They were always there. They were necessary, in a way. They reminded you that courage was not the only legitimate response to impossible situations. Sometimes survival was. She thought about herself on the Ridge Road in December. 12 cents? Tornum? No luggage? walking through the dark toward a town she'd never seen because she'd made a decision she had to keep making or it wouldn't hold. She knew exactly what the Greers of the world felt because she had felt it herself. The difference was only what you decided to do with the feeling. The response from this company's regional office came on a Wednesday, 5 weeks after Hale had ridden south. It was addressed to Gideon, which surprised nobody, and it was long, several pages, the formal language of an institution covering its own position while communicating a practical resolution. Eleanor read it twice. Gideon read it once and handed it to her, and she read it twice. The substance of it was this. The company acknowledged irregularities in certain local debt arrangements conducted by its former agent. Hale was referred to throughout as former agent, which answered the question of what had happened to him after he left Black Hollow. The rate discrepancies were acknowledged, and the affected debt amounts were to be recalculated at the standard terms. The early call-in was formally rescinded. The affected families would receive new documentation with corrected figures and a standard repayment timeline. There was no admission of fraud. There was no language that constituted an apology. The letter was constructed with the care of something written by people who had legal counsel and used it. But the practical result was clear. The Pritchards were not losing their house. The Saunderses were not losing their house. The Waits were not losing their house. And somewhere in the middle pages, in language that was almost bureaucratic enough to miss, there was a paragraph about the operational review of Black Hollow's territorial management structure, and the company's intention to appoint a new regional liaison who would, in the phrasing of the letter, conduct operations in accordance with standard company policy and maintain appropriate relationships with the settlement community, which meant, in plain language, that whoever came next had been told what happened to Hale. Eleanor set the letter on the desk. She stood there for a moment with her hand flat on it. She was not, she noted to herself, as relieved as she'd expected to be. It was the right outcome. She'd known before she read it that it was the right outcome because she'd read the situation correctly and the logic had held. But the thing itself, the physical letter on the desk, felt less like a victory than like a door closing. The end of something that had required everything she had for 3 months and was now simply over. Gideon was watching her. He did that sometimes. Waited while she processed something. Didn't rush to fill the space. "It's done," she said. "Looks like it." She picked up the letter and folded it along its original creases. "I'll take copies to the families today." "I'll come with you," he said. She looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "I want to." They went together. Margaret Pritchard cried, which she would have been embarrassed by if she'd had any energy left for embarrassment. She read the letter at her kitchen table with her husband standing behind her, his hand on her shoulder, and when she got to the paragraph about the rescinded call-in, her face did something complicated, and then she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and sat like that for a moment. Her husband looked at Eleanor over his wife's head with an expression of such plain and uncomplicated gratitude that Eleanor had to look away from it briefly, because she was not good at receiving that kind of gratitude directly. She could receive the practical kind, the coal arrangement, the jar of preserved plums. The other kind landed somewhere without a clean surface for it. "It's not perfect," Eleanor said, because she wanted them to be clear. "The debt is still real. Amounts are just corrected. It's still going to take time to pay." "I know," Margaret said. She'd lowered her hand. Her eyes were still wet, but her voice was steady. "But we know what we're paying now, and we know why. And it's ours to deal with, not something being done to us." She looked at Eleanor. "That's different." Eleanor thought about that on the walk to the Saunders house. It was a clear day, cold still, but with the particular quality of cold that was beginning to relent. The kind where the sun through it actually carried some warmth if you stood in it long enough. The mud on the main road had a crust of ice over it in the shaded parts and was soft in the sun, and she and Gideon walked on the edges where the footing was better. "She's right, you know," Gideon said. "About what?" "The difference between something being done to you and something you're dealing with yourself." He looked ahead down the road. "It's the whole thing, really, the whole difference." She thought about that for a while without answering. The Saunders took the news more quietly, with the particular relief of people who have been holding a difficult position for a long time and are now carefully, almost suspiciously, setting it down. Robert Saunders read the letter standing at his own doorway, and then read it again, and then looked at Gideon. "Who wrote to the company?" he asked. "Officially, I mean. Who made this happen?" "The families wrote the dispute letter," Gideon said. Hartwell and Fletcher wrote to Regional. Saunders looked at Eleanor. And the documentation that came from you. It came from Hendrik Haas's records, she said. His wife kept them. Saunders was quiet for a moment. I should go see Mrs. Haas, he said. She'd appreciate that, Eleanor said. He would go. She knew he would go because she'd come to understand that Robert Saunders was a man who paid his debts, not just financial ones. He'd been frightened, not selfish, and there was a difference. The news moved through Black Hollow the way all news did, quickly, layered with interpretation as it traveled. By the evening, the version most people had heard was approximately accurate, which was better than usual. Fletcher came by the boarding house that night without being summoned and sat at the table and ate dinner with the residents and didn't say much. But before he left, he stopped in the doorway and looked at Eleanor. The foreman wants to know if you'd be willing to consult on the camp kitchen operations, he said. We're expanding the east shaft in spring. More men coming up. Eleanor looked at him. He can come ask me himself. The corner of Fletcher's mouth moved. It was, she'd learned over the months, as close to a smile as Fletcher generally got. I'll tell him that. Hartwell came the following morning and asked himself, with the particular discomfort of a competent man doing something unfamiliar, which was asking for help. She said yes, and they worked out an arrangement that was reasonable for both sides. And Hartwell left looking relieved in the flat, private way of men who don't show relief openly. Gideon, watching from the desk, said nothing until Hartwell was gone. You're building something, he said. She was at the kitchen doorway. She looked at him. I'm doing what makes sense. That's usually what building something looks like from the inside, he said. She thought about that for a moment and then went back to the kitchen because she had a lot to do. Spring came to Black Hollow. The way it always came to mountain settlements, not cleanly, not as a single event, but as a series of retreats by winter. The snow came back twice after it seemed to have gone for good, and the second return was substantial enough to make people briefly anxious. But it went again, and what followed it was mud and then green, and the sound of water moving where ice had been, and longer light in the evenings that changed the texture of everything. Cal turned 22 in April. Eleanor knew this because he'd mentioned it once, in passing, and she'd filed it. She made a cake on his birthday, something she had not done for anyone in the boarding house before, and brought it to the dinner table at the end of the service, and Cal looked at it with an expression of absolute disorientation that made several of the other men laugh. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know, she said. He ate 2 pieces and took a third upstairs and didn't say anything else about it, but the next morning he was in the kitchen 30 minutes early without explanation, washing dishes that didn't need to be washed yet. She put him to work on something useful, and neither of them mentioned the cake. She was learning, in those spring weeks, how to be in a place, not passing through it, not managing a crisis in it, not strategically understanding its architecture from the outside. Actually being in it, in the daily accumulation of small moments that make a place into something you belong to. It was harder than the crisis management had been, in some ways. The crisis had given her a clear purpose and clear opponents and the structure of an emergency to organize her days. The spring just gave her days. She was 34 years old and she was learning to have ordinary days, which was harder than it sounded if you'd spent several years not having them. She told Gideon some of it one evening in late April. Not all of it. She wasn't ready for all of it, and she didn't think she'd ever be the kind of person who told all of it in one sitting. But they were sitting at the table after dinner, in the way they did most evenings now, with the lamp and the accounts, and the comfortable working silence that had been the baseline of their relationship since December. And something about the spring evening through the window and the particular quality of the quiet made her say something she hadn't said before. I left a town like this one, she said, about 3 years ago. Gideon looked up from the ledger. He waited. It wasn't exactly like this one. Different territory, different operation, but the same structure, company control, debt arrangements, a man like Hale. She looked at the table surface. I'd been there 2 years. I tried to do what I did here, and it didn't work. The man who ran it there was smarter than Hale, and the people were more frightened, and I didn't have... She paused. I didn't have the right conditions, or I didn't know how to use them. Gideon was very still across the table, listening. I left, she said. At night, with what I could carry, which turned out to be not very much. I told myself I was being practical. I told myself I was making the right call. She was quiet for a moment. I spent 2 years telling myself that. What do you think now? He said, quietly. She looked at the lamp. I think I ran because I was afraid. And I think being afraid was legitimate. I think the conditions were genuinely bad, and I wasn't wrong about the odds. She paused. And I think I've also spent 2 years on back roads because I couldn't find a way to forgive myself for it. The room was very quiet. That Ridge Road in December, Gideon said. It wasn't a question exactly. I was done running, she said simply. I didn't know what this place was going to be. I just knew I was going in and not coming back out until it was finished, one way or another. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. His face did the thing it sometimes did, the careful, unperformative thing, where what he was feeling was present but not displayed, contained but not hidden. I'm glad you came down the Ridge Road, he said. She looked at him. I know, she said. They went back to the accounts. But something had shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not in a way that required acknowledgement, but in the quiet way that things shift when two people who have been working alongside each other for months move an inch closer to the actual territory of knowing each other. She was not in a hurry about it. She was discovering not in a hurry about most things anymore. The urgency that had carried her through the winter, that compressed relentless pressure to do the next thing and the next, had not disappeared, but it had settled into something more sustainable. She could feel the difference. The new company liaison arrived in May. His name was Adler, and he was younger than Hale by 15 years, and came with the slightly overcareful manner of someone who had been very specifically briefed before arrival. He introduced himself to Hartwell first, then to Gideon, then came to the boarding house for a meal, which Eleanor suspected was intentional, a way of demonstrating that he understood what the boarding house was in Black Hollow now, which was not just a place where men slept. He sat at the dinner table with the other residents and ate, and was polite and said very little that was substantive, which was fine. He was reading the room the same way she read rooms, and she respected the methodology even if she intended to be equally legible to him. After dinner he came to the kitchen doorway and found her at the stove. The families, he said. The corrected documentation went out? It did, she said. And the situation is resolved from the settlement's perspective? She turned and looked at him. He was about 30, with an organized, neutral face and the eyes of someone who was smarter than he was letting on in this particular moment. The situation is that 3 families know what they actually owe and have a workable timeline to pay it, she said. Whether that's resolved depends on whether the terms are honored going forward. He met her gaze. They will be. Then yes, she said. It's resolved. He nodded. I heard about the supply kitchen during the storm. The coal arrangement. It worked, she said, and went back to the stove. He left the next morning, and she didn't see him again for 6 weeks. When he came back for a routine visit, and was so unremarkable in his conduct that people barely commented on his presence, which was, she thought, exactly what a company liaison in Black Hollow should be. Summer arrived and the boarding house kept changing, not dramatically, in the incremental way that reflects genuine change rather than performed change. The dining room gained a second table because the meal service had grown to the point where one table was insufficient. Cal, who had moved from mine work to helping with supply logistics, started handling deliveries and keeping Eleanor's ordering system running on the days when the workload in the kitchen was too high for her to manage both. He was good at it, methodical, honest to the cent, reliable in a way that had nothing to do with being told to be reliable and everything to do with who he actually was. She told him this once, directly. He looked at the floor for a moment in the way young men do when they receive honest praise and don't quite know what to do with it. Then he looked up. My mother ran a boarding house, he said, down in the lower territories. I grew up watching her do it. Eleanor looked at him. In 5 months, this was the most personal information Cal had offered about himself. Was she good at it? Eleanor said. The best, he said. Then after a pause, she died 2 years ago. That's why I came up here. She looked at him for a moment. I'm sorry, she said. Not the reflexive kind, but the actual kind. With the weight of someone who understood what it was to carry a loss around with you inside the practical business of staying alive. Yeah, he said. He picked up the supply ledger and went back to work. She went back to the stove. Some conversations don't need to be longer than they are. She'd learned that. The sign above the boarding house was repainted in August. Gideon did it himself, on a morning when the weather was right for it, warm and dry, no wind. He got the paint from Devlin and came home with it and set up the ladder himself and worked on it for the better part of a morning. Eleanor came out onto the porch at some point and looked up at him on the ladder with the brush and the paint and said, "You could have asked someone to do that." "I know," he said. "You're not terrible at it," she said after a moment. He looked down at her. High praise. "Don't push it," she said and went back inside. The sign said Cross Boarding House, G cross and E. Veil. Prop. He hadn't asked her before he painted it. She'd seen it when it dried and stood in front of it for a moment without moving. When she came back inside, Gideon was at the desk doing accounts. He didn't look up. "You should have asked," she said. "I know," he said. She sat down across from him. She looked at the lamp. "It's right, though," she said. He looked up then. Something in his face was careful and direct and entirely without pretense. The face of a man who was not going to perform this moment, but was going to be in it. "Yes," he said. "It is." She went back to the kitchen. The first snow of the following winter came in November, earlier than expected, which no longer panicked anyone the way it might have a year before. The reserve system Eleanor had built was now standard practice, not just at the boarding house, but at 3 other establishments in the settlement, including Devlin's, who had expanded his dry storage with the exact dimensions she had recommended, and had not thanked her for the recommendation, but had implemented it with the promptness of a man acknowledging good advice without saying so. The miners' families had their own informal network now, the one Eleanor had helped organize during the worst blizzard, and that had not disbanded when the emergency ended because Margaret Pritchard and 2 other women had correctly identified it as something worth keeping. They met on Fridays at the boarding house, which meant Eleanor's kitchen provided coffee and whatever was available from the day's baking, and the meetings were practical. Supplies, needs, shared labor, the ongoing management of lives in a difficult place. Eleanor didn't run the meetings. She was in the kitchen during them. But she was available, and they knew it, and occasionally someone would appear in the kitchen doorway with a question, and she would answer it, and they would go back. It was not a system anyone had designed intentionally. It had assembled itself out of the particular conditions of one terrible winter and the choices people made inside it. Eleanor thought about that sometimes, how the most durable structures were often the ones that started as responses to emergencies, and found that they were needed even when the emergency was over. Mrs. Haas came for dinner twice a week through the whole of that second winter. The original arrangement, meals for corn, conversation included, had long since dissolved as a transaction and reconstituted itself as simply a fact. On the evenings she came, she sat at the table after the service was done, and Eleanor sat across from her with tea, because the evenings were long and the old woman had more than 9 years of Black Hollow stored in her memory, and she was not finished with it. In December, on a night when the snow was light and the wind had stilled, Mrs. Haas looked across the table and said, "Hendrik would have liked you very much." Eleanor wrapped both hands around her mug. "Tell me about him." And Mrs. Haas did. The question Eleanor had asked herself on the Ridge Road in December, whether she was done running, whether this was the decision she could make and keep making, had a different quality now than it had then. Then it had been a willed thing, a choice made against the pull of the habitual response. Now it was just true. She had not become someone who didn't feel fear. She had become someone for whom the fear had found its right size, present, honest, neither denied nor allowed to run the operation. She thought about this sometimes in the early mornings, in the hour before the boarding house woke up, when the kitchen was hers alone and the stove was going and the light was still gray through the window. Those were the hours that had always been most purely hers, the hours she'd had even in the worst weeks of the winter, that daily starting point, the smell of the fire and the coffee, and the particular quiet of a world not yet fully awake. She was not a different person than she'd been on the Ridge Road. She was the same person in a different situation, a situation she had helped to build, in a place she had helped to change, beside a man she had come to know, with the particular completeness that comes from working alongside someone through genuinely difficult things. There was nothing romantic in that completeness, or rather the romantic quality of it was inseparable from the practical quality, because they were the same quality applied to the same person. She had not sorted out all her own complications. She was not, and would never be, an uncomplicated person. But she was, for the first time in years, a person who lived somewhere on purpose. That was not a small thing. She knew that, because she knew what it was to live nowhere on purpose, to be always the person arriving and never the person arrived. It was Cal who asked her about it directly, because Cal, now 22 and managing the supply operation with quiet competence and an expanding understanding of exactly how things worked in Black Hollow, had developed the habit of asking questions that other people left unasked. He came into the kitchen one morning in December, 1 year, almost exactly, since her arrival, and stood near the window in his particular way, the way he had of being somewhere without announcing himself. And after a while he said, "Do you remember when you first got here?" She was at the stove. "Yes." "What did you think it was going to be?" She thought about that. She thought about standing at the north end of town in the dark, with the wind off the mountain and the lantern light of the settlement ahead of her, and Clarence Mudd on his stall squinting at her, and the particular quality of arriving somewhere when you have decided that arriving is what you are going to do. "I didn't know," she said. "I knew what I was done with. I didn't know what came next." "And now?" She considered the question. "Now I know what I'm building," she said. "That's different." Cal looked at her. He had the face of someone taking that in, turning it over, testing it against his own experience of the past year. He'd been building something too, a version of himself that was more than the frightened 21-year-old who'd walked down from the mine with blood on his face and collapsed against the woodpile. He knew it, she thought. He was becoming someone who knew it. "Yeah," he said, "it is different." He went back to the supply ledger. She went back to the stove. Outside, the snow was falling, the quiet kind, without wind, the kind that accumulated patiently without drama. Black Hollow was settling into its second winter with Eleanor Vale in it, and it was a different settlement than the one she'd walked into on a December evening with 12 cents and a torn hem and exhaustion behind her eyes. Not transformed. That was the wrong word. Transformation implied something total and completed, and Black Hollow was neither. It was still rough and cold and imperfect. The mountains still closed it off for months at a time. The work was still hard, and the pay was still not enough, and men still got hurt in the mine shafts, and families still struggled with the math of surviving in a place this far from anything easier. But the people in it were connected to each other in ways they hadn't been before. They had records of what they were owed and what they owed. They had a network that had survived the emergency that created it. They had a boarding house at the center of the settlement that smelled, every morning at 5:30, of coffee and fresh bread. And that smell, which sounds like a small thing, was not a small thing if you understood what smell does to a person who is cold and tired and far from easier ground. It reached into something older than thought. It said, "Someone started this fire for you. You are not alone in this." The sign above the door said Cross Boarding House, G Cross and E. Vale, Prop. Eleanor had painted over one letter of her first name in September, because the original rendering had been slightly off, and it bothered her. Gideon had noticed and hadn't said anything. She'd noticed him not saying anything and appreciated it. It was imperfect work. All the real work was. Well, on the first evening of that second winter, a traveler came down from the North Pass just after dark. He was young, couldn't have been more than 20, with the look of someone who had been walking for a long time and had started to wonder if the walking was going to end anywhere in particular. He came through the door of the boarding house and stood in the warmth of the front room and blinked in the light, and Eleanor came out of the kitchen and looked at him. He had almost nothing with him. The coat was wrong for the weather, and he had a small bag over one shoulder, and the eyes of someone who was exhausted in the way that went to the bone, but alert underneath it. Watching, arriving. She recognized that. "Are you looking for work?" she said. He looked at her. Something in him settled slightly. The particular settling that happens when a person who has been bracing for difficulty finds a plain question instead. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about standing on a ridge road in the dark a year ago, making the decision she'd made. "There's a room available," she said. "Sit down. There's food." He sat down, and in the kitchen behind her the fire was going.